Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and me, Israel Smith. All right, Matt, welcome back.
Thank you.
This episode is part 2 of the Semmler story. The previous episode covered kind of the earlier part of their lives and as they get into having the paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you give a little brief overview?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the story of the Semmler family, namely Bill Semmler. William Semmler went by Bill, his wife Margaret, and their 2 daughters, Adeline and Ada, and the News Bulletin, which was founded in 1919 here in Mokena. It was the Mokena village paper. They carried news from the other surrounding towns too, but it was primarily, first and foremost, the Mokena paper. And the Semmler family and their publication were a great source for good in the decades that it existed. They benefited not just the Mokenians of their own day, but the way I see it, they're still benefiting us now because they documented the history of the village in the years that they existed. And because of them, we now know what happened in the Mokena of yesteryear. And if it wasn't for the Semmlers, we'd be totally in the dark. And
you realize how true that is as, you know, we read more about the things you've written or these pieces. And it's people like this across the country, really, that were the keepers, of the story, the historians, they were writing the history for us when nobody else was doing that. So that's, this was, I thought, a great story. And obviously you've committed a lot of time to this. As I mentioned before, we got the booklet that you prepared earlier. And then you put this out in 4 parts on your blog.
That's right.
As well. And really the only in-depth discussion and telling of their story. I think that's been done. So
that's definitely true.
And now we kind of come to the second part and the conclusion. Let's just get into it.
Yeah, let's. The News Bulletin was no small-town gossip rag. Aside from covering all local happenings, it also carried 4 or 5 serialized novels a year, as well as national and international news illustrated with photographs. A representative example would be a piece that appeared in an August 1931 issue that showcased the construction of the Empire State Building. Zesty flavor came from numerous bits of humor that appeared in the News Bulletin's pages, such as an early series of columns called People of Our Town, which lampooned various personalities found in rural communities. Characters such as the irate reader, a man who has found something in this paper that he doesn't like, who is going around to bawl out the editor, were highlighted. Also featured was the classy loafer, who was waiting for a good job to turn up when he is going to blow this hick town. Another piece of whimsy was Stille Nacht, a reprinted column that appeared in the June 21st, 1929 issue that not only pastiched 2 men looking for a speakeasy, but was also partially written in German. In December 1924, the Semmlers ushered in a column called The Clearinghouse, in which Mokena residents were encouraged to write into the paper and share their opinions on issues of the day. The zeitgeist of the era springs forth from these columns, in which townspeople voiced their views on the prohibition-related crime wave that plagued the countryside around Chicago, decrying everything from hard roads, which made escape very easy for the bandits in their high-powered cars, to mail-order guns, which oftentimes arouses some cracked brain nuts to start on a hold-up career. Bootleg liquor also stood in the crosshairs, which in the words of one village resident, was being sold to weak-minded fools to drink and kill themselves with. At the end of the 1930s, a series of fictionalized letters were printed in the News Bulletin under the title Uncle High Says. These had a lighthearted humoristic bend and were loaded with political jabs and inside jokes about Mokena business people. In the same era, a thinly veiled editorial column named Bugle Calls existed in the form of pieces written under the nom de plume of Zeb Potter. Another column called Voice of Vox Pop appeared with some regularity. In a March 17, 1939 piece dripping with local satire, one Back Alley Spike wrote, "Boy oh boy, Mokena has a real crisis. Europe has been hogging every crisis, but now we have one right here. Why, it's the biggest scandal since Hitler took Austria." The piece went on to parody stodgy Mokenians, whose feathers were ruffled by a political newcomer running for local office, with the monokered author glibly adding, "Why, the nervy young so-and-so, he hasn't been living here 75 years yet." The true flavor of the news bulletin came from the great American tradition, the snide letter to the editor. An early example of towny salt was the communication printed by the Semmlers in July 1921, in which a resident complained about the less than optimal condition of village streets, a subject that would later prove to be a big one for Bill. The writer asked, "What are the streets of Mokena for? Are they a garbage pail?" And admitted that, "My temper gets the best of me when I have to drive my clean machine over eggshells, muskmelons, and lemon shells, corn husks, and muddy slop holes." Referring to Bill Semmler's status as village clerk at the time, the anonymous writer threw a barb his way when he snarled, "Say, Mr. Editor, maybe you will scrap this as you are a member of this board, but if you do, there are other papers." The many letters received by the Semmlers weren't all grumbly, many were laudatory. Typical were the words sent by John H. Koppel of faraway Mattoon. Koppel had spent his formative years in Mokena, and like Bill, could trace his heritage to the founders of the village. In March 1926, he dropped a line to the News Bulletin office reading, "I want to congratulate you for the good paper you are putting out. As I enjoy reading of the old hometown very much, I can hardly wait until the paper comes. The people of Mokena and vicinity ought to be proud of the paper you publish." Closing on a touching note, Koppel wished, "That you may prosper in your work is my prayer." Another representative bouquet came by way of an unidentified writer to the Joliet Spectator in 1939. In what surely must have left their editor a touch confused, the correspondent breezily complimented the publication, only then to quickly heap praise upon the News Bulletin, expressing, "I like our Mokena paper. It is a well-printed and newsy country weekly, far above the average country weekly in get-up and print. I want to congratulate the editor of the Mokena News Bulletin for his fine paper." The Semmlers also received a bouquet from none other than the Chicago Tribune. During the euphoric period immediately after the end of the Second World War, Norma Lee Browning of the prestigious publication found herself in Mokena, vividly profiling local residents and life in the village. Upon examining the News Bulletin, she declared that its makeup has dignity, its reportorial style has a cosmopolitan touch. Mokenians used the News Bulletin as a forum to quash rumors, the bane of small-town existence. A wave of malicious hearsay that had been spreading in the area regarding farmer George Hauser induced him to write to the paper in the spring of 1933. Facing foreclosure on his farm, he wrote, "I would like to get a few lines in the News Bulletin and let the public know the truth about the gossip that has been going on about me." Addressing each piece of the story individually, he eventually came to the nastiest part of the episode. Hauser stated, "There was also some gossip being circulated that I threatened a shooting, and this is a lie. I did not come from fighting stock." Those who were on the starting end of hearsay also got a chance to speak. During a period in October 1924, when some burglaries had recently taken place in town, hardware storekeeper Milton Kropp sold some keys to residents Peter Hummerding and Alois Peschera. Finding the purchases suspicious, Kropp tipped off village constable John Frisch. Later realizing his mistake, the shopkeeper wrote a note to the newspaper, which reprinted it on the front page under the heading, "An Apology." Explaining what had happened, the Mokenian made his realization clear that the event had cast a serious reflection on the characters of both Mr. Hummerding and Mr. Peschera, and as they are entirely innocent in this matter, I hereby publicly extend my apologies to them for the statement that I made to Officer Frisch concerning them. Bill and Margaret Semmler weren't simply journalists reporting the news, they were also arguably Mokena's most passionate advocates, who used the news bulletin to lift the community in every way. A long column published in the February 11th, 1921 issue called "What Can Mokena Do?" addressed a shortage of housing in the village and a general sense of stagnation that had crept in. Bill penned the piece, which cheered, "Mokena would have a future if everyone got together and pushed, and let us see how some small improvements can be made which will lead to bigger ones." While warning that out-of-date customs do not work anymore, he devotedly pushed for development, patronizing local businesses, and keeping up the town bandstand at Union and 3rd Streets. Bill's editorials leapt off the page and forced the reader to take notice. In reading them, one came to see that his heart beat for Mokena. In response to later accusations that his paper was favoring the advancement of other nearby communities, Bill authored a front-page editorial called "Mokena Needs Cooperative Boost." Appearing in the April 15, 1926 issue, Semmler defended his stance that the news bulletin always stands ready to boost any worthy project or undertaking that is for the betterment and welfare of any community, and to knock everything that knocks the town. Coming straight to his hometown, he said, "This town has the finest opportunity in the world to become one of the best towns along the Rock Island, but whether it does or does not, all remains not with its citizens, but with its businessmen." Calling on Mokena's tradespeople to band together and promote commerce in town, he also declared again that the old petty jealousies that have dominated Mokena for years must be eradicated before the village will progress. At present, we have too much of that old spirit. It doesn't pay to nurse this spirit. Cut it out and let us all work for one goal: the upbuilding and progress of Mokena. Another editorial, which appeared in the September 7th, 1928 edition, addressed a particularly prickly issue. A piece was printed detailing how some town boys had been caught in the basement of an abandoned Front Street building, allegedly in the act of setting it aflame. The young men later turned up at the news bulletin office down the street, claiming that they merely had the misfortune of being found with a kerosene lamp in their possession, and that they'd been spinning their wheels in the community with nothing to do and nowhere to focus their energy. Titled, "Youths Present Social Problem," the subsequent editorial on this matter said, "The fact of the matter is these boys are right. The youth of today will be the citizens of tomorrow. The old idea that a boy or girl must sow their wild oats is all the bunk. Let us wake up and do something for the youth of our community." The news bulletin was also used as a platform from which to defend the rights of others and stand up to bullies. With World War II in full swing in Europe, but still more than a year before the United States entered the fray, the summer of 1940 found no small amount of chatter swirling around Will County concerning spies and other nefarious elements. Joliet citizen Otto Ator, editor of a paper called The German American, got mixed up in the hearsay, and the Semmlers came to their fellow newsmen's rescue. In a long article called "Don't Believe or Repeat Everything You Hear," that appeared on July 12, 1940, it was reported that a poisoned tongue whispering campaign had leveled charges of Ator's being involved with anti-American activity, and that he had even been taken into custody by the FBI. The reports were soundly quashed by the news bulletin, the Semmler stating outright that all the stories about him are idle gossip. The column went on to explain that Ator had ample proof that he has never been engaged in any subversive propaganda, and he is 100% for his adopted country. There has not been one word of truth in the yarns broadcasted about him. An even wilder tale was also making the rounds in the county seat, where one Paul Schurne found himself under attack based on his ethnicity. The German-born hotel proprietor was also supposed to be under the investigation of government agents who allegedly had found Nazi flags and uniforms in his possession. Speaking on Schörne's behalf, the news bulletin printed that this yarn was just one big lie from start to finish. Mr. Schörne has been a citizen of this country for many years and has always been a loyal American citizen, one whose integrity has never been questioned. The column had the final word by gently reminding Mokenians that a person's good name and reputation, which has taken years to build up, can be blasted and ruined overnight. This is a sin none of us should be a party to. Jealousy, hate, and loose tongues are the cause of ill-founded yarns. Let us be really and truly Americans in every sense of the word. Do not be a scandal or warmonger. Showing great foresight, Bill Semmler was a champion of the preservation of the old Denny Cemetery on the southern edge of Mokena. Bill had taken an interest in the historic site, then a forlorn, overgrown heap, as early as the World War I era, when he was still a young beat reporter for the Joliet Herald-News. Interred at the hallowed grounds were the remains of Revolutionary War soldier Charles Denny, whose original 1839 gravestone was weather-beaten and crumbling by the early 20th century. Applying valuable experience gained while securing a government-issued grave marker for local Civil War veteran John Van Horn, buried at Marshall Cemetery in 1909, Semmler helped to get a new headstone for Denny in 1916. The marker arrived in Mokena via the Rock Island Railroad in the dead of winter and was stored inside W.H. Beckstein's grain elevator until the weather broke. Years later, Margaret would call the marking of Denny's grave one of her husband's proudest moments. The Mokena Garden Club set out to clean up the tangled mess of weeds and overgrowth in the old family cemetery in 1939, and the News Bulletin was their biggest supporter. That Armistice Day, Bill was given the honor of bestowing a new name on the site, which thenceforth was known as Pioneer Memorial Cemetery. In the same vein, the paper was instrumental in causing the observance of Memorial Day to become a yearly occurrence in Mokena, where heretofore it had been an intermittent rite. At the early date of 1921, the Semmlers propelled local residents to action by publishing an impassioned column called What About Memorial Day?, in which it was alluded that the neighboring communities of Frankfort and New Lenox could be counted on to have a full program, where in the Mokena cemeteries lie soldiers who fought not only in the Civil War, but also in the Revolutionary War, and must their graves be allowed to be overgrown with weeds instead of flowers and with brush instead of flags, just because we are too indifferent, or might we say not patriotic enough, to honor their memory? The next year, using flags and flowers procured by the Semmlers, the News Bulletin sponsored a smart ceremony, wherein the local soldiers' graves were decorated and various speakers were invited to town. It went over well, and starting in 1928, a regular program was carried out annually, with the Semmlers spearheading it. Later, the Boy Scouts helped ease the burden of their work, and while down the line the Mokena Civic Association took over the day's activities, Bill Semmler still served in a place of honor as chairman of arrangements.
So, Matt, in previous stories, we've talked about John Hatch taking a big role in cleaning up and Pioneer Cemetery. Where's the time frame in that? Had that kind of was it previous to the Semblers coming in? Can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. Because the whole history of how Memorial Day has been observed in Mokena is a pretty long and interesting one. But John Hatch, who was a local Civil War veteran, and was the owner of the grain elevator in town for many years, and a general storekeeper, just a businessman very involved in Mokena, first village clerk. As he got older, he took on a lot of the work of observing Memorial Day, making sure that his fellow Civil War veterans' graves were cleaned up and in presentable shape, making sure they had a flag on them and flowers on them, stuff like that. as I was saying, as he got older, though, he kind of started passing things off to the local campfire girls, which we've talked about on the podcast. They were an organization kind of like the Girl Scouts. And he sort of showed them the ropes and showed them the individual graves and made sure that that they were taking up their responsibilities. But Mr. Hatch passed away in 1920. And at that time, the campfire girls had also disbanded. So in that time frame, the early 1920s, nobody was really doing anything.
So it just got left, again, to kind of be abandoned and overgrown.
Exactly. Yeah, there really wasn't anything going on year to year Memorial Day wise in Mokena. And I think Bill Semmler hit the nail right on the head when he said, well, Frankfurt always does something, which they did. Frankfurt years ago in this time frame was going all out for Memorial Day. New Lenox could always be counted on to be having something. So he said, why aren't we doing anything? We have just as patriotic of people in our town as theirs. Let's get it together. And he was a big part of making sure that happened from year to year.
And from the time that this happened with him to now, has it pretty much been maintained consistently since then?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much, yeah. As far as I know, every year. I'm thinking back to the years of the Depression and World War II, and of after having gone through the issues of the News Bulletin from those years, no year is sticking out in my head as having been one where something didn't happen, even with those hard times, depression, wartime, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, we can pretty much thank him.
Yeah. I mean, it points directly to his legacy, and that's very cool.
Perhaps Bill Semmler's most enduring contribution to Mokena was his tireless activism for the improvement of Wolf Road, arguably the village's most important thoroughfare. Much like those leading away from the heart within the human body, a vital artery is the lifeblood of a community. The vibrancy of a village depends on it, as do the livelihoods of the merchants therein. An impassable road spells stagnation and despair for any neighborhood, and no one was more aware of this than Bill Semmler. Through his resolute, unflagging work, Wolf Road went from a muddy path to a modern passage. For much of Mokena's early existence, what would later be known as Wolf Road was barely more than a rural farm lane, known as Marty Road, after a family that farmed along it. Well into the early 20th century, Bill and Margaret's daughter Ada remembered how, in anything less than perfect weather, the road was real muddy, rocky, and tough. Bill Semmler loathed these conditions with a passion, often risking getting morassed in Wolf Road while traveling north to Orland Park to collect news. Thus began his personal quest to bring the road into modernity. Through his local networking skills, Bill was able to win over important allies in this drive. In his corner were Charles Hirsch, a cattleman and farmer along the road, and J.V. Hall, a neighbor to Hirsch who kept a small restaurant. Other influential friends of Semmler's who pitched in to help were L.G. Bruder, a Chicago businessman and Mokena resident, and Emil Koppel, a local farmer who also served as Frankfurt Township Highway Commissioner. Together these men, with Bill Semmler as their leader, formed the Mokena Development and Hard Road Association in the early 1920s. By December 1926, not only did the Mokena territory not have any hard roads to speak of, but it also had the dubious distinction of also not being connected to any. The association held regular evening meetings at the village schoolhouse, and through much perseverance, succeeded in convincing property owners north of town in Cook County that the concreting of Wolf Road would benefit them. Through lobbying on their part, the neighboring county's Board of Commissioners was persuaded to include the section of the road from 143rd Street south to the county line on a paving program. All things considered, however, this new hard road still tapered off well north of Mokena. Bill Semmler and his fighters triumphed when a Will County bond was passed for the paving of the rest of the length through town. With the task ready to be completed, what the news bulletin later called a spirited fight broke out over which route the new road should follow. One local block supported the construction of a brand new artery following a convoluted route from east of New Lenox through Mokena along Front Street, then continuing further eastward until it linked up with Keene Avenue, or today's Route 45. Bill Semmler, and by extension the News Bulletin, found this route totally unreasonable and tirelessly promoted staying with the plan of completing Wolf Road south to the Lincoln Highway. In the words of his daughter Ada, in this period the entire project became a political football, with strife abounding between Mokena factions and the Will County Board of Supervisors, which ultimately held up the paving of the gap for several years. Meanwhile, the first concrete was poured north of town on October 15, 1930, and when the section was finished a month later, a special ribbon-cutting ceremony was held at St. Mary's Hall. Bill still worked to have the last segment from Hickory Creek south to Lincoln Highway finished, but the dust wouldn't ultimately settle until the autumn of 1936 due to a property dispute of epic proportions with farmer Clarence M. Cleveland. During the trying days of World War II, the Semmler family opened their hearts to the community and made sure that every local serviceman and woman had a friend. Partnering up with the auxiliary to the William Martin post of the VFW, they saw to it that every Mokena soldier, sailor, or Marine regularly received a free copy of the News Bulletin. By Christmas time 1943, this operation had become so big that area residents were flummoxed as to how the Semmlers were pulling it off. Many curious requests were coming into the News Bulletin wondering about the details. So a column that appeared in the December 17th edition gingerly said that an explanation had heretofore been held back as, "We do not care for credit, our only aim and satisfaction being to know that our boys in the service of our country are receiving the paper and enjoying it." However, to satisfy readers, the piece did go on to lay out how it was all done. Aside from the News Bulletin, the Semmlers' Orland Park Herald and Tinley Park Times were also being posted, and while there had been some reports of hiccups with delivery, generally the papers were finding their recipients. In the very beginning of the effort, Adeline and Ada Semmler handled all of the addressing of the paper's wrappers themselves, with some help pitched in by Margaret. As the project grew, this part of the work was taken over by local volunteers. On every Thursday evening, the papers would be packed into the addressed wrappers by more town volunteers. Among them were some patriotic Mokena children who gave their time to the effort. Ever thankful for their time, Margaret rewarded the kids with hot chocolate at the News Bulletin office. The postage for all of the papers, no trifling amount, was taken care of by the village's auxiliary to the VFW. At the conflict's height, some 700 complimentary copies of Semmler Press's papers were being sent to all corners of the globe, wherever fighting men and women from Mokena and the neighboring communities were located, be they well behind the front lines or at the front. During the course of the war, touching thank you letters flooded Mokena for the Semmlers, many of which came enclosed with photos of the service people who wrote them. On June 12, 1943, Private Sherwin Lease penned a note that partially read, "Dear Mr. Semmler, this is the first I have written to you, although I should have done so long ago. I am now in North Africa and have received 2 news bulletins since I have been here. Although they meant a great deal to me in the States, they mean so much more now." On December 28th of the same year, Navy man and village trustee John Marty wrote from Mare Island, California. A few lines read, "Dear Bill, it sure is swell when Tuesday comes around, for that is the day the bulletin arrives. I always look forward to reading all the news from hometown folks. You sure are doing a grand job for us fellows in the service, as it sure means a lot to us to hear what's going on in the old hometown. By the time the autumn of November 1944 rolled around, the News Bulletin was reporting on servicemen and women so much that it was beginning to push out other local news. On September 21st, Bill personally authored a column assuring readers that other news was still wanted, deeming, "If the news rates first page, it will be put there anyway," but kindly asked the neighboring sports teams to simply summarize their games, as the scores were taking up too much space. It was signed, "Yours for victory, and until our boys eat hamburgers in Tokyo, William Semmler, editor." As the years and decades marched on, the paper grew exponentially, and by 1943, it could proudly boast a circulation of around 3,000 in eastern Will County. Meanwhile, the Tinley Park Times was doing so well that it was necessary to open a separate office there in 1941. The publications of the Semmler Press had become such a time-honored institution that at the end of 1944, they were bestowed with the Certificate of Merit from the Illinois Press Association. Bill Semmler lost a hard battle with cancer on June 8, 1946, at the age of 59. Thence ended a chapter not only for the Semmler family, but also for Mokena. Upon the news of his passing being made public, tributes poured into town. Illinois Senator Richard Barr called Bill a true American, while Will County Clerk Joseph Hartley rued, "I don't know a man I thought more of than Bill Semmler." Everett Cooper, mayor of Mokena, the scene of so many of Bill's labors of love, said that, "In Bill's passing, the community has lost one of its most loyal citizens and a very true friend." Obituaries for him appeared in papers as far off as Alton and Decatur, while on June 14th, the News Bulletin itself dedicated most of its large front page to their editor in black-bordered reportage under the title 30, which in journalistic parlance signifies an end. At the time of his passing, Bill Semmler was a member of the Illinois Press Association, the Cook County Publishers Association, the Lions Club of Frankfort, and was also the chairman of the Mokena Civic Association's Publicity Committee. That year, he was also included in Who's Who in Chicago and Illinois. It was his final wish that Margaret take the helm as editor-in-chief of the News Bulletin, which she faithfully did, maintaining a good newspaper worthy of fine American principles. Running the publication was a Herculean effort, so a managing editor, Oliver Gedeist, was hired by the Semmler family in early 1947. He was introduced to Mokena and the surrounding territory in a column of the paper, where Margaret assured her neighbors of his journalistic bona fides, and kindly urged readers to cooperate with him. Showing the homey spirit of Mokena at the time, she invited subscribers to personally call her with questions and also wondered if there might be a house in town for Gedeist to rent. Soon after, Oliver Gedeist announced himself in a section of the paper, and well aware of his status as a newcomer in the small town, warned Mokenians that he was bad with names. Gedeist was also acutely cognizant that he was following in Bill's footsteps, writing that, "In coming into this new responsibility, it is my purpose to carry the responsibility in such a way that the memory of William Semmler will be integrated in and be a basis for every business transaction conducted. The Semmler standard shall never be lowered." And that he did, for week after week, the paper was the same quality as it always was. Meanwhile, the News Bulletin marched into the future. In 1947, an addition was added to the east side of the historic office to house 2 new linotype machines and a Mila press. Business continued to boom, and another extension to the old place, this time on its northern side, was finished in the spring of 1953 to house a duplex press. The new press weighed in at a colossal 13 tons and took a pair of workers a month to install. Their labor was worth it in the end, for the new equipment carried an output of 3,500 8-page papers an hour. As editor-in-chief, Margaret Semmler won well-deserved laurels for her work. After publishing a special souvenir edition of the News Bulletin for the Mokena homecoming in the summer of 1949, the Illinois Press Association bestowed upon her the Mate E. Palmer Award for that year, while the next year she received the prestigious first prize from the National Convention of Press Women at Reno, Nevada. After decades of selfless service to Mokena, Margaret semi-retired in the spring of 1955, whereupon Glenn F. Logan of Joliet took over as managing editor. At this time, the News Bulletin counted a circulation of around 3,500 and maintained a staff of 10. Margaret Semmler ultimately sold the paper in 1958 to Kenneth Johnson, a Lamont-based publisher who put out that community's Lamonter as well as the Lockport Herald. In addition to these publications, Johnson would also later found newspapers in Downers Grove and Naperville. In 1960, he set up the Frankfort Leader, and that year added Mokena to the News Bulletin's title. After continuing to print the News Bulletin for most of the rest of the decade, Johnson sold his holdings to Field Enterprises, who in June 1969 merged the News Bulletin and the other local papers into the Southwest Graphic. After having been in print for 50 years, no small feat for a publication with such humble beginnings, the last issue of the News Bulletin came off the press on June 4th, 1969. Its front page contained stories touting the new graphic and bemoaning high tax rates, and thus, when the reader finished the last page, it was the end of an era. While staying in the hands of the Semmler family, the paper's old office on Mokena's Front Street would go on to house a cork company, and met an untimely end in the fall of 1977, when it was forever erased from the village's landscape. Margaret Semmler spent her later years in a Joliet retirement community, always keeping her trusty typewriter at hand, and surrounded by scrapbooks of her and her late husband's achievements. She has gone down as one of the most influential ladies in Mokena's history, and to this day, she hasn't been equaled. She passed away on March 4th, 1988, having reached 98 years, the doyenne of the village. The Mokena of the modern age, in all of its progress and improvement, is the legacy of the Semmler family and the News Bulletin. The village owes their memory the highest attention and devotion. As we honor our history, the work of the Semmlers has become a Rosetta Stone to the village's past, without whose long efforts over the decades, this chronicle would be dark and uncharted. Through the News Bulletin and their passion for Mokena, the Semmler family's achievements have brought them immortality.
I think you sum that ending up just really well.
Oh, thanks.
Just displaying the importance of this couple to Mokena.
Yeah.
As well as the surrounding area. I mean, you think about the other papers, the Tinley Park paper that they ran.
Yeah, absolutely.
They had, just as you said, it's just an unbelievable effect they've had on this village.
Yeah, they have. They really have, yeah. A big influence.
And I thought it was interesting, they, in the beginning where they were encouraging people to share their news, it kind of reminded me of almost like the social media of today. Like it was how people got to tell, who came to dinner, who visited from Chicago.
Absolutely it was.
Or whatever it was.
Yeah, no, that's...
covered the politics and the gossip and the
that's absolutely true.
Activities.
Yeah, 100%, yeah. Yeah, they collected all the news either just by going out and physically collecting it themselves or by inviting people to, like we were saying, to just contact them with so-and-so was in town. Or it's
funny stuff to read now because, who would ever really care about who came to visit?
Right.
Until you look at Facebook.
Yeah, exactly.
Because people do the same thing now on Facebook,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. It's no different.
I walked my dog, or whatever.
Exactly. It's 100% the same.
Which is really interesting. I mean, how we change everything changes, but it all stays the same.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. Yeah.
And funny enough, I guess in all the talking we've done about this, I've always called it the Mokena News Bulletin.
Right.
And it wasn't until the very end that they added Mokena into the title. So that was interesting, and I'll try to correct that.
Oh, no, yeah. I'm sure years ago people did the same thing. I mean, after all, it was the Mokena paper.
Right. And not too many people probably know that offhand nowadays anyway.
Right.
But
exactly.
And I thought it was really interesting when they're talking about the success of Mokena, that Bill put the weight of the progress on the businessmen.
Yeah.
He didn't put it on the citizens or the politicians. He put it on the businessmen.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know. I guess that's true today, right? Unless you have people willing to come in and invest. When you think about our downtown, that is less than lively.
Right.
Yeah. So
it's interesting.
What do you, knowing the amount of time that you spent looking at these old papers, what do you think that the community or our community is missing by not having something like that paper?
Oh, wow. First and foremost, I think a paper brings like a sense of unity and togetherness, and it's all of us together for our community, kind of something like that. With the extinction of the Mokena Messenger a few years ago during the COVID times, I rue its loss, and I feel its absence. Mm-hmm. Having a paper in a community is just like one of the most important things you can have. Not only because it reports the news and what's happening, and people are up to date on what's happening in their community. But like I was saying, there's just something about having a hometown publication that I think brings about this togetherness or this unity. And hopefully somebody will step into that void.
Yeah. Do you thinking about it, do you see a time where there is a type of a physical publication again, or somebody putting out something similar to this, a modern version?
Yeah, I do. I can't say who it would be. People have suggested that I should do it, which I'm honored by, but I have neither the time nor the resources.
Well, and that's the big thing. I mean, it's a resource
Exactly.
And especially when there's not a big market for newspapers right now that are physical. Everything, is pretty much gone digital.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's an interesting thought. There's something about picking up a paper off your driveway. I also thought it was really interesting when we talked about the proposed road. And one of the routes that they mentioned was going through New Lenox, through Front Street.
Yeah.
And connecting over to 45, to LaGrange Road.
Right.
For one, that would have been a huge change to Mokena and what we know it. Connecting to a major road like that, it would have been a totally different downtown.
Oh, yeah. It would have changed everything.
Yeah.
It would have been crazy. Yeah, the amount of work that would have had to go into that, the construction.
Sure, it would have probably stripped most of the historic buildings through Front Street.
Probably,
would have had to been gone.
Yeah, luckily, Mr. Semmler, Bill Semmler, was not really a fan of this idea and used his publication to sort of promote Wolf Road.
Yeah.
Instead of constructing a new road, let us use Wolf Road. And if you look at all the papers through that whole time frame of the 20s going into the 30s, by the time the whole thing was done, it was just this huge, never-ending project of lobbying and politics and getting the funding for this and getting the property rights to pave, or not really pave, but concrete this stretch of the road. And it was just this monumental, gigantic project that carried on for years and years and years.
And in comparison, we just got through a project where the bridge over I-80 on Wolf Road was down for a number of months and caused terrible turmoil.
Oh, absolutely.
People going out of their way, routes change, all this stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But we have Wolf Road back, and it's not a muddy trail. It's we can't even imagine what life would have been with a road like that, and how much that road changed Mokena.
That's 100% true. Yeah, every time I drive down Wolf Road, I think of the Semmler family and Bill Semmler. And let me just put this out there. In Tinley Park, there is a Semmler Drive or Semmler Street or Avenue, whatever, in one of the subdivisions out in Tinley, because he played a part in the history of their community as well. But he was a Mokena man. And first and foremost, he was a Mokenian, and he dedicated his life to working here and making Mokena a better place for us to live. And there is no street or road or anything named after him or his family here. So we can put that out there. Maybe someday, hopefully in the not too distant future, we can change that in Mokena.
I mean, you can't think of too many better names that should be on a sign.
Yeah, yeah.
50 years of being the paper of record for our town, and 50 consequential years, that they're responsible for.
That's true.
So Bill died on June 8th of 1944 at the young age of 59 years old.
That's right. Yeah. 1946.
1946. And then the paper stayed around until June 4th of 1969.
Yeah. Mrs. Semmler kept it up after Mr. Semmler, Bill, passed away. Like we were saying, tragically young, really. It was cancer. But she was already kind of unofficially the co-editor of the paper anyway, but she took over being in charge and running the show herself. Kept going all the way up there until the end of the 1950s, when she retired and sold the paper to the Lamont publisher. And then they kept it up. And finally, very last issue, 1969. So that's 50 years of history that it preserved.
And did anybody kind of pick up the torch after that? Was there another paper going on at that time?
Not really. There was a Mokena paper in the early 70s for a very brief time. Of course, now I can't remember the name of it. It was not around very long. Of the Mokena Herald, maybe. Unfortunately, all the details of who was running that and all of the background info is not known to me. And then there was the Frankfurt Star for most of the 80s. I think it might have went back into the 70s a little. They carried a lot of Mokena news though. But the only paper after the Semmlers that was a Mokena paper in name and was sort of like a Mokena first and foremost kind of thing was Independent News, which was founded in 2001. So that's kind of a long time after 1969, which was editor was a Mokenian by the name of Bob Baker, who ran that for a fair amount of time in the early 2000s.
And then when does the Mokena Messenger come around?
Mokena Messenger, if I remember correctly, their first issue was in 2007.
And what was the setup with that? Was that part of a conglomerate, a bigger newspaper?
Yeah, they were the Messenger was part of a conglomerate called 22nd Century Media, who owned and ran all sorts of local papers out in this neck of the woods. There was, I think, the Frankfurt paper by them was the Frankfurt Station, I want to say. Then there was the New Lenox American and the Orland something or other. I can't remember. But yeah, that was a conglomerate, 22nd Century Media. I think they had papers out in other portions of the state. They weren't strictly like a Eastern Will County.
Yeah,
Southern
and
Cook County.
Did they have somebody local here running the paper, or how does that work?
Yeah, they did. They had an office. 22nd Century Media's office was right. I guess technically that was an Orland address, but it was just immediately north of what you would call the border between Mokena and Orland. And they had quite a few editors actually over the years. The final editor of the Mokena Messenger was a Mokena guy by the name of Tom Kramer, who is I still know and actually is a coworker of mine now. So I knew him from my days of submitting history articles to the paper, and I still work with him nowadays. Still a Mokena resident. So yeah, so that was the good thing. I mean, there were local people working on the Messenger too.
Yeah,
they weren't out of towners or anything. So.
Yeah. Well, and it's, you never know. I mean, we got the paper and always enjoyed it, but I never fully understood where it's coming from. I knew it wasn't a true local paper, but it was Mokena's paper.
Yeah, that's right.
As far as being,
sure, yeah.
But yeah, definitely missed when that went away.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
And always enjoyed the great history stories that you shared.
Oh, thanks.
Definitely sparked my interest for Mokena history.
Oh, yeah.
As
Good.
well. So this, probably the one of the most consequential stories, that we'll tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
The story of the Semlers. Thank you, Matt, for sharing this. Thank you for putting this record together.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Yeah.
As you said, hopefully we can get more recognition for this couple. Maybe a name on a street sign somewhere.
Something. Yeah, please.
And for those board members, village trustees, whoever it is, let's recognize these significant members of our past.
Absolutely, I'm 100% behind it.
Yeah. All right, Matt. Thanks again. This is a great story.
Thank you. I love telling it.
Hope you enjoyed part 2 of the episode about the Semmler family and the Mokena News Bulletin. As we've said all through the episode, this couple is very important to Mokena. They have a great story, and we owe so much of what we know today, what Matt's done, what we've been able to do, so much that leads back to the Semmlers and the work they did over the 50 years that the newspaper was reporting here. So again, we hope you enjoyed that. Matt has a 4-part series on his blog that these episodes were based on. So please check that out as well. He had some great photos in there. Some of those we'll share on our Facebook page as well. But you can check those out on his blog as well as read the full 4-part story. And be sure to subscribe to Matt's blog. You'll find the link in our show notes, but you'll get notifications when the new blog posts come out, and just some really interesting stuff there. Matt's been posting for a number of years now, and just some great articles on there. If you're enjoying our podcast, it really travels by word of mouth. If you're enjoying our show, please consider just telling a friend or a neighbor about it. We would love it if you'd leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, or anywhere that you can find a podcast. Those reviews really help out a lot and get us in front of more people. If you know someone that you think we should talk to or ideas for the show, please send us an email at MokenasFrontPorch@gmail.com or send us a message on Facebook. We hope you enjoyed our first year of episodes, and we look forward to many more. So thanks for listening, and we will see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.